Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sea Watch Books podcast. Glad you've joined us again. This week, I am delighted to have Grant Walker on the podcast. As you guys know, Grant is the author of three of the volumes that we've done for the Rogers collection of Dockyard models. And we have a really great conversation about the Rogers collection and about some of the other things that are going on with the museum at the Naval Academy, as well as what's going on with Volume 4. So hope you enjoy, and it's always a pleasure talking to Grant and hearing what's going on. So hope you guys enjoy the episode. Welcome, Grant. Glad to have you on the podcast, and thanks for joining us.
This is a pleasure. I'm looking forward to it.
Excellent. Well, listen, obviously you and I have worked together a little bit since I took over Sea Watch, and we
Right.
finally got Volume 3 out of the Rogers collection, which everybody loves. But I'd love to talk to a little bit, about you and kind of how'd you get to where you are now? What's your background? I understand you're a West Point guy, and how's a West Point guy get to the Navy?
Yeah, well, it is a long and complicated story, but basically, the Naval Academy likes to keep a couple of Army guys around here just to remind the midshipmen what we look like. And I was in Brussels finishing up an assignment there, and I called up the Army and said I need a new assignment. And they offered me this teaching position at the Naval Academy. And I said, the Naval Academy? Actually, I always wondered if I'd like to teach, and I think I would. And I had just gotten married with my wife, Anique, in Belgium, and she's Belgian. So I thought she would like Annapolis. It's kind of a quaint old town. And so we took the position. Surprisingly, I thought it was going to be in political science. It turned out to be in history. So I had to do an awful lot of cramming that first year to keep a class ahead of my sections. But that's how I came here. And I stayed as a teacher here, an instructor of history in the department for 6 years. And then I finished up my 20-year Army career and wasn't ready to leave Annapolis yet. So I just moved across the street, literally, into the museum, where a mentor of mine in the history department had just been named the director of the museum.
Mhm.
So he introduced me to the staff. In particular, Don Prule's predecessor as the ship model curator, a guy named Bob Sumrall. And he was an old chief and kind of a crusty guy, but he liked me, didn't resent me being an officer. And we got to thinking about the models. I was so attracted to the models anyway. And the idea of writing something about them came up. And honest to goodness, I told him that I thought it would take about 6 weeks to to summarize the Rogers collection. And Bob introduced me to a friend of his, Frank Fox. And so we traveled down to Birmingham, Alabama, where Frank lives. And after a day or two there, the two of them decided to bow out of it and give me the whole project. So that's how I came into the project of writing up the something about the Rogers collection.
Gotcha.
Of course, instead
But
of
prior to that, so you are curator at this point, or you are the officially
yeah,
caretaker.
it took me years and years to get a position here. I was just living on my savings and my pension for a long time. But we got a job, a position here as education specialist first, but that eventually morphed into a curator job. So I'm not the curator of ship models, that's Don Prule,
Gotcha.
but I am a curator, and Don is the model maker. So
Yep.
I explore the models and break strings and whatnot, and Don comes to the rescue and fixes my messes. Um,
So then, it was in your capacity, really going to the museum, that you were introduced first to ship models in general and the Rogers collection in particular. Is that right?
well, yes and no. I didn't know anything about ships or ship models when I came here. But in those days, back in the late 80s and early 90s, some of the dockyard models were not in the museum. They were spread out in different buildings on the grounds here. And we had two of them in the history department. And I was observing them one day along with another professor, an older gentleman named Jim Thomas.
Mhm.
And Jim kind of talking to himself, he said, I think the labels on these two models are switched. One of them said it was it represented a ship from 1705 and the other from 1710. And I said, well, that's only 5 years, Jim. What, how did you come to that conclusion? He said, well, that's because the model supposedly from 1705 had a gizmo on it that wasn't invented until after 1710. And I looked at him. That's when the scales fell from my eyes. And I said, you mean to say that these models are that accurate? You can tell after 300 years, just a 5-year difference? And he said, yeah, that's because the models were built when the ships were built. And I was, as the British would say, gobsmacked. And that did it for me. I was hooked at
And that
that
was it,
point.
huh?
That was it. That's right.
And so what'd you do from there? So you realize the difference between, that the ship models were built at the same time and that you can tell, that level of detail can, determine when. So kind of where'd you go from there?
I went to England. Over the next few years, I took 10 different trips over there, based on the National Maritime Museum, where I was readily accepted. Everybody was pleased. They weren't resentful that an American was messing around with British models. Quite the opposite. They were delighted that somebody was paying attention to this big collection here,
Mhm.
because all the folks in England, in this field, they knew about the Rogers collection, but nothing had been written about it since 1946. Frankly, there have been a couple of subsequent editions, but they didn't change anything, and so people were curious about our collection and happy that I was paying attention to it. So they introduced me to all the wheels over there, specifically Brian Lavery and Simon Stevens.
Mhm.
And Brian, of course, is the guy who's written all of the summary books about the Age of Sail and the bigger ships. And I also met Rob Gardner, another publisher editor, who introduced me to how to do research in the archives. And he's the last word on smaller ships in the Royal Navy from way back when. And eventually, during those trips, I also traveled down south from London and met John Franklin. And John's book, Navy Board Ship Models, became my Bible. It's
Okay.
still the most wonderful book. And I have a couple of copies of it. And we brought John over here, and Brian and Simon came over here. Op Hoving came over here as well
Yep.
for a conference that Bob Summerall had set up. And so it was like a family of these experts who took me under their wing, and they'd written these wonderful things, and I read them back and forth, and then we got into personal relationships, especially with Simon, who was obviously still with us.
Mhm.
And he opened up all of these archival things there at the Maritime Museum, and we just went to town studying those old Rogers models.
So that's great. So for those who might be listening who don't really know, God forbid, haven't read your books yet, but
Yeah.
what is the significance of the Rogers collection? How did the Academy come to acquire them and get to where they are now in the museum?
They came to us as a bequest from Colonel Henry H. Rogers. Rogers was known at the time as the millionaire colonel, because and in World War I, when America joined the war in 1917, he was the first guy down there to the recruiting office, said, I want to help our country and I'm ready to go to the Western Front. And they said, well, Rogers, you've been in the New York National Guard for 15 years. You've got a lot of experience. We'll make you a colonel in the U.S. Army and send you over to the Western Front, which he did in 1918. Participated in several offensives, very credibly, apparently. He came back in 1919, resigned his commission in the Army, and turned his attention to his businesses and ship models. He got the ship model bug, but as a collector.
Mhm.
Now, they called him the millionaire colonel because Colonel Rogers was born into the Standard Oil Company. His father was a co-founder of Standard Oil with John D.
Ah,
Rockefeller. So Rogers was built. He was born in an enormous mansion and he lived the life of luxury, but he liked the outdoors, probably because his father was such a big presence that he wanted to get a little distance there. So Colonel Rogers, his timing was absolutely perfect because when he resigned his commission in 1919, um, we were just about to go on the biggest economic boom the country had ever seen. He was already enormously wealthy. And this was just the time when people over in England started to make attention to the models in England.
Mhm.
And models became the thing throughout the 1920s for some serious collectors and amateur collectors. And everybody was really agog about these models. So Colonel Rogers was at the right time in the right place. And he devoted the roaring 20s to assembling his collection. When the stock market fell in 1929, he stopped collecting. His models were scattered here and there, and he built his own private museum on his own grounds and put all his models there. And then in 1935, he died.
Mm.
And much to everybody's surprise here at the Academy, his will said that he was bequeathing his entire collection to the Naval Academy,
Oh, wow.
provided that they had a home for the models. And we didn't have a separate museum building at that time, so they built this one. Um, I guess there were other reasons to build a museum, but in all honesty, they built the museum to get the Rogers models.
Oh, really? Okay.
And his other provision was that they had to have a curator to take care of them. And that, of course, was government money. So Congress had to pass all these laws to provide the money for a salary for a curator. And Rogers was married 3 times. So you can imagine after his death, he was so wealthy. The wives all went at each other in court. But when the dust finally settled in 1938, the models came here. They were trained here. They were put on a train. We had a train station in Annapolis at the
Oh,
time,
wow.
right outside the gate. And they came in 1938. The museum was completed in 1939, and they've been here ever since.
Okay, great. And how many are there?
Well, the original bequest had 108 models in it, and I know that Rogers didn't do this on purpose, but exactly half of them are what we call dockyard models,
Mhm.
54. The other half consisted of 20 French prisoner of war models from the Napoleonic era, and then 3 dozen models that are a smattering of ship models from the later 1800s right up through the early 20th century. And most of those, there's not all of them, most of those are not nearly as precious as the dockyard models are. There are some humdingers in there for sure, but when I settled upon this, what turned out to be a career, it was the dockyard models that attracted my attention. So
Great.
54 of them were dockyard models, and 54 of them were other kinds of models.
Gotcha. Okay. And so then you started your documentation or your sort of analysis of these several years ago, correct?
Oh, many years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, that very first inkling that I might want to do something on the models turned into a number of magazine articles, not scholarly journal models, but lots from the Nautical Research Guild
Mhm.
and so forth. And I kept going back to England to learn more and more and more about them. And eventually, your predecessor at Sea-Watch Books, Bob Friedman, I met him through the Nautical Research Guild, along with Rob Napier.
Mhm.
And Bob immediately started wheedling me to write a book about the Rogers models, about the dockyard models in the collection. And it took him years to persuade me to actually do it. Well, I finally made the plunge in I forget, early 2000s.
Right.
And it took me several years to get the first one out, and several years to get the second one out, and several years to get the third one out. And now I'm about to embark on the fourth one. I've already embarked on it.
Yep. Yep.
And so we initially thought there would be 6 books, and then we changed around and so forth. We settled on 4, and that will be my contribution to all the knowledge I've thrown everything I can think of about those models and the ships they represent into the volumes in this series.
Yeah, great. And we love them, and actually I want to come back to volume 4 in a little bit. But first, kind of given all the research that you've done over the years, not for the articles and things, what's some of the more surprising things you've found in researching these?
Um, a number of them, we learned a great deal about them when I went over to England on one of my first trips with Bob Summerall, and those guys at the National Maritime Museum were just starting to work with fiber optics. They had a very primitive system there, but Bob and Simon showed us their arrangement, and he and I looked at each other and said, "Man, we got to get one of these." So we came back to Annapolis and met the right people who had the connections, and we ended up with an array of fiber optic surgical gear. But instead of poking into knees and stomachs, we poked into the models. And the things that we found inside those models that you just couldn't see or couldn't see well from the outside was astonishing. Model after model showed us treasures, and a lot of the things we discovered the models had started off as one thing and ended up as another. You could tell from the inside.
Mhm.
Um, we found names inside of the models, a couple of the models. We found a note in one of the models, but that was because we took it apart. All the glue was failing on it, and we determined to take it apart and re-glue it together,
That was
and in the
Princess
bottom of
Royal.
the hold. No.
Oh,
That's another model that I still have. It's got on the rear, it's got the word "Inconstance," and there was a ship just like it, a frigate from the 1780s named Inconstant, and we always thought that's one of the few models that we're absolutely sure that that's the Inconstant from 1780. Except the note that we found inside it said it wasn't the Inconstant. That it was another model altogether, another ship altogether, but she was a sister of the Inconstant. And so we determined that the model builder, something happened to him just before he finished the model, and somebody else finished it. We could tell all of that because of the note, and it took a lot of research, but we finally put 2 and 2 together. So with the fiber optics and some of the research that we done in the models themselves, we learned a great deal.
mm,
Now, you mentioned the Princess Royal. Of
mhm.
course, we learned a great deal about the Princess Royal as well, because just like the Inconstant model, um, the Princess Royal's glue was failing.
Mhm.
And I walked past it one day. It was on display. It's one of our most striking models. And I noticed a window mullion that had fallen out of the model and was lying on the deck. And then a couple of weeks later, I found another piece of the model that had fallen out and was lying on the deck. And then one of the beams gave way.
Mm.
And I eventually actually pretty quickly determined that if we didn't do something, we were going to end up with a pile of sticks.
Yeah.
And that would be a shame. Summerall was still the curator, but he had cataracts. He couldn't see as well as he should have. And frankly, he didn't have the skill required to do a complete redo of the Princess Royal. So we got with the class of 51. Now, the Naval class of 1951 has been our primary financial supporter since way back in the late 80s.
Mm.
Um, and they eventually put together a fund that we could dip into um, for various and sundry projects. And they, for decades and decades, they have provided all the money that we needed either to buy equipment for the shop where we do our reparations and scratch building, and for the gallery itself. So their fund is limited to the Rogers collection.
Okay.
That's kind of a unique situation, but it's worked out beautifully for us. And we approached the class of 51, and they agreed that they would underwrite the renovation of the model by whoever we chose instead of Bob Summerall. He didn't resent it whatsoever.
Hmm.
And we started at the very top. We surveyed all of the modelers in America, and even we considered going overseas. But the first guy at the top of our list was Rob Napier, who we all thought was the premier model builder in America. And he jumped at the chance.
Yep.
And so the rest of it is kind of history. Rob came down here, took 2,000 pieces off that model, um, and ingeniously figured out how to keep track of them. And then we shipped it up to his house in Newburyport,
Right.
Mass. And he spent a couple of years putting it back together again. And he learned all kinds of stuff about how that model was built.
Yep.
We still don't know to this day if one guy did everything on it or if it was a crew, but we all seem to think it was a crew
Right.
because every aspect of the model was done at the very highest level.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And he
that's
obviously wrote
another
a
aspect.
book about that for Sea-Watch, and it was great.
Yeah,
And we had him on the show too. And I'm
right.
curious, like, because I talked to him about like, when he received it and stuff like that. But as a person in charge of the model, when you guys boxed that thing up and shipped it out of the museum, well, that must have been a pucker moment for you guys.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was. But Rob was so competent. I mean, he took to this thing and it was like watching an artist doing a painting, just disassembling it. So I did go up there and checked on him a couple of times, and he opened his world to me doing that. I'll never forget the time he took me on a personal guided tour of the New York Yacht Club,
Right.
and he knew those models so well. Everything about him. He spent years as their
Yep.
de facto curator.
Yep.
And I watched how he did things, and he explained what his potential methods would be to renovate the model and fix what needed fixing. But he did stick to his primary belief that he wanted to make the model the way the original modelers wanted it to look.
Right.
So,
Not change it at all. So,
right.
I'm curious. So within the Rogers collection, not that you would, but if you could take one home and just secretly have it as yours or your favorite, which one
Yeah.
would it be?
Oh gosh, it's probably the one I'm most interested in at that time because they're all so super. We do have a couple of seriously super models in there. Our model of the Sussex of that's an 80 gun ship. Oh my gosh, I'm trying to think of all the dates here, but it was 1683 and she went down in 1684, and we have the model of that, and it's just pristine.
Mm.
Nothing's been done to it. The poor ship lasted less than a year, and there's a whole story about how she was carrying a treasure, and it goes on and on. But that's a pretty special model. Our Britannia model, also of 1682/1701, is a fascinating, wonderful big model. And we have a couple of frigate models that are really special. But it's very hard for me to say, well, this is the one I would take to my island retreat.
So
Because
your home would become very crowded with all the models that you'd want to take.
Yeah, it would. I wanted to mention as well that from early on, I determined that we should use as many modern technological devices and methods to explore these centuries old model as we could. So first you just look at them with your eyes. And then I say very early into the process, we acquired fiber optics to peer inside them,
Mm,
which was quite something. Eventually, we CT scanned a number of them at our local medical center. And we've also done chemical analysis, X-ray fluorescent spectroscopy, which has shown us a great deal about the materials that went into the models.
mm,
So that's been a sort of a, a base, if you will, to approach examining the models.
right.
That plus the archives over in Kew has given me, all the information that I've acquired.
Right. And what did the CT scans show?
Oh, they can show you, for instance, the grain of the wood, and you can see where the grain going one way bumps into the grain going another way. Hence, there's a joint right there that you couldn't tell otherwise.
Oh, interesting.
We found things inside the model that we had seen. Oh, I forgot. The next thing after the fiber optics was X-raying before
Mhm.
we got to the CT scan. And we found some things on the X-rays and we just could not explain them. Things were inside those models that we couldn't figure out. But with a CT scan, we could see them in 3D essentially. And some of these mysterious fittings and whatnot came to light, and we could see that they'd broken off and were sitting upside down and looked pretty weird, but that's what they were. So the CT scan was more wonderful. I wish we could do some more.
Did that take some convincing of the head administrator of a hospital that you're going to bring a ship model in?
Yes, absolutely, it did. There was a fellow um, in the Nautical Research Guild who was a personal friend of the director of the hospital here.
Mm,
And they got together, and he was delighted. Um, when we x-rayed them, we had learned we had an x-ray facility right here at the academy, but we still had to get the models from the museum to the academy, to the hospital, to the clinic. We put them in a vehicle, and then once we got to the doors of the clinic, we put them on a gurney and we wheeled them in, and all the people there waiting in the wings there for their doctor's appointments were oohed and awed by watching us bring this ship model in on a gurney. And the same thing happened with the CT scan. It was great fun. We did record everything that we were doing with it. It was fabulous. Yeah.
that's fun. Yeah.
Now people are telling me, radiologists are telling me, oh, those CT scans you've got, they're so primitive. You should see what we've got now. So I'd love to do some more with the latest, up to datest
Well, we'll have to find a
equipment.
radiologist to get us in on that.
Yeah, maybe so.
Um, so all right, so let's go back to the work that you did for Sea Watch. So you wrote the three volumes. We just published the third volume last year, and you started
Yes.
work on volume four. What's volume four going to cover?
It's going to cover everything that hasn't been covered in the first three volumes. The way I worked it out, again, we were gonna do this in 6 volumes, and they would essentially mirror the 6 rates, from the biggest ships afloat in the Royal Navy down to the smallest ships that still sailed with the fleet. Um, and so in I broke it down eventually into 3 deckers, 2 deckers, and single deckers, all rated warships. So the first volume was first and second rates. They're 3 deckers. The second volume was third and fourth rates. Those are 2 volumes, 2 deckers. The third volume was the fifth and sixth rates, frigates and whatnot. And now volume four is going to do all the unrated vessels. That's vessels that were too small to sail with the fleet, um, or vessels that were not part of the Royal Navy. And when I say that, the dockyard models in our general sense they represented Royal Navy ships. But we also have three ship models of East Indiamen, for
Hmm.
example. So I didn't put them in the first three volumes because they're not rated warships in the Royal Navy,
Right.
but they're still dockyard models that were made at the same time as the ship, and they are by themselves quite fascinating. Then we have a fire ship that will be in volume four. We have a couple of yachts, a royal yacht, and a state-owned yacht. We're really not sure what that is, but we do know that Greenwich has a model of the same vessel made by a different model maker, but is absolutely the same vessel. So it may have been a state-owned craft of some sort. Um,
Is this
and
Fubs?
no,
Okay.
no, this is a different model
Okay.
of a different vessel, but um, uh, the Fubs is one of the I think 26, is it 23 um, royal yachts that were built by Charles II and James II.
Right.
And the Fubs, of course, is one of those. And we have what I think is another one of those. But this is yet another
Okay.
model. We didn't even know it had been called everything under the book. Um, and a lot of people, when I started this business, thought it was a Dutch model. But Op Hoving came over here and he said, "Well, I don't know what this is, but Dutch it ain't." So it's definitely an English model. Then we have boat models. Colonel Rogers managed to acquire 6 boat models, and they'll be in the fourth volume as well.
Great.
So
So how many models roughly in volume four in total?
18.
18.
When if I'd have if I'd have known when we started this, I could have done the first and second volumes, which total 18 altogether. The third volume, which has 18, and the fourth volume has 18. It would have been beautiful. 3 volumes instead of 4, but this has been a learning experience as we go along.
Sure.
So there'll be 18 models in the final volume as well.
Excellent. Well, I know we are all very much looking forward to that. So we'll keep us posted on how that's going.
Oh, I will. I will. I have a couple of other projects that I want to finish up. Um, before I plunge wholeheartedly into volume four. I have written the basics on the 6 boat models and the fire ship. That one's ready to go. So 7 out of the 18 are already pretty well along the line, and the 3 Indiamen will get me over the halfway mark. So we're
Excellent.
still hoping that it will be done in for me record time.
That's great. And then, so obviously, Roger's collection is sort of the jewel of the Academy's collection, I guess. But there's other collections too. What other model collections are there? Ship model collections.
Well, the primary one, of course, is at Greenwich.
Right.
I have done my best to count all of the English dockyard models that are out there, and it comes to a somewhat over 400. Greenwich has the biggest collection. They have roughly 250.
Mhm.
We have the second biggest collection of, well, we started with 54 and we've acquired a couple since I've been here. Um, then the Kriegstein brothers, they're Arnold and Henry Kriegstein, both doctors, are sort of our day's version of Colonel Rogers. They are
Mhm.
collectors, and they've spent their lives hunting down um, models that were still in private hands and eventually managed to acquire them. So they have a collection that is almost as big and deep as ours. Um, I can remember when I first started, the reserve collection for Greenwich was at a place called Kidbrook, only a mile from the Maritime Museum. And at the time, it was just a series of Quonset huts, great big Quonset huts. that had guards posted all around them and so forth. And one was devoted to the models. And you could walk into that building and cast your eyes at the shelves and see over 200 Dockyard models
Wow.
in a glance. Now that's been disassembled now, if you will, and they have their models. They've moved their models out to Chatham, which is a wonderful facility, but you can't see all 200 of them at a time.
Right.
So I feel particularly lucky to have been able to do that.
Oh,
Simon
sure.
Stevens showed me those on a number of occasions.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and
uh,
what I was actually going to ask is at the Naval Academy Museum, what other sort of non-Rogers models are there?
oh, we have almost as many uh, non-Rogers models on display as we do the Rogers models. All of the Rogers models are in one gallery upstairs. All of the Dockyard models and all of the French POW models, they're in one gallery and takes over most of the second deck. Um, but we have down on the first deck, which is devoted just basically to the history of the U.S. Navy, we have all kinds of models from colonial period up until uh, Don Proul built a model of the Hudner,
Hmm.
which is a modern Aegis class destroyer. So we have quite a few models from um, ships from the American Revolution and the War of 1812. We have quite a few models of Civil War vessels and on into the Spanish American War and World Wars One and Two. Now, these aren't dockyard models, they were made after the fact. But many of them were made by serious modelers using the plans that were used to build the ship,
Hmm.
just not at the same time when the ship was going up. Although the Hudner was finished pretty much when the ship was finished. Um, so um,
And
so
you,
we have quite a few others. Yeah,
yeah, and I think you guys just came into a collection of miniature models,
we
right?
did the Matt
Talk
Brooks
about that one.
collection. Mr. Brooks is a serious yachtsman, and he had managed to acquire a wonderful collection of 40 models, all built at extreme miniature um, scales. So the models are just, many of them are just little itty bitty models like this, but they include, out of those 40 models, 10 French prisoner of war models,
Mm.
some of which are just exquisite, and 10 models by the doyen of the miniature, micro miniature ship model uh, style, the doyen of the 20th century, Donald McNary.
Hmm.
So in one fell swoop, we got 10 French POW models and 10 McNary models. And then we got the other 20 by some wonderful model makers, Philip Reed and Lloyd McCaffrey and several others. So that collection is standing by, and we have made all the plans and actually started on the construction of a large room on the second floor next to where all the Rogers galleries are going to be, and that'll be the Matt Brooks collection.
Hmm.
And it probably won't be done for another year, maybe even a year and a half. It takes time to do these things, but we are going to give them quite a show. We've got all kinds of ways of enabling visitors to zoom in on these teeny itty bitty little models
Mm.
and see details you just wouldn't believe.
Yeah.
So we're very anxious to get that up and running. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've seen a couple of it. They're exquisite. I'm really looking forward to having that on
Yeah.
display. And it sounds like it could be a good topic for another book once you're done with the volume four of
Yeah.
Rogers collection, right?
Well, I mean, the idea has crossed my mind. I will admit. So we'll see how that turns out. But
Excellent.
it's a wonderful collection, and we're very, very pleased to have it.
Excellent. Yeah, it's great. So, well, listen, Grant, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate the time. Is there anything that did I miss anything? Is there anything you kind of want to let people know? How can they, if they haven't, how can they come see the Rogers collection and the other collection?
Yeah, we consider ourselves, or I do at any rate, as a hidden jewel, and we are hidden people, many of our visitors, we get about 10,000 a month, and the majority of them are not aware that the Naval Academy even has a museum, much less that it has a museum stocked with all of these precious models. So we advertise ourselves on all the social platforms and so forth as much as we can. Um, as I said, there had not been an original catalog written about the collection since the end of World War II. We got the first one out in 1946, and the descriptions of the models were simply copied into later editions that included pictures. The first one didn't have any pictures in it. Then there were a couple in the 50s, and the last one was done in 1971. So that's a long time ago now, 50 years. And I'm hoping that the volumes I've written and the fourth volume of this series will bring people who acquire those books up to modern times. And so much work has been done on the ships of ancient times and the ship models that replicate them, starting in the 1920s. Right up to Brian Lavery's books and Rob Gardner's books and Simon Stevens' books,
Yeah.
and John Franklin's book and so forth. So much more information is available to us now, and I've tried to cram that into the books I've written. And I invite everybody to come to the Naval Academy. The museum is free. You can come here and um, you just go through a security thing like at an airport, and then you get on the grounds here and work your way over to our museum. We have a lot of very interesting buildings here, but obviously the museum is where I hope everybody will end up. And many times we see people just with their jaws open. They had no idea that we were here. On occasion, we get somebody who comes here specifically to look at just one model or one particular model or so forth. But we want everybody, as many people as we can, to come here and enjoy our collection, and maybe they can get a preview by getting some of the books.
There you go. Absolutely. No, it is. I sort of second that. I mean, it is an absolutely exquisite place to go. I spend hours there every time I'm down. So please, if you haven't gone, definitely go make a visit and say hi to Grant and the team down there. So, well, Grant, this has been great. I really appreciate the time. And we're all eagerly awaiting volume 4, and we'll have you back on when that's done and talk about what we find there.
Okay, that'll be great, and I look forward to that as well.
Excellent. Well, thanks everyone. Thanks, Grant, and we'll see you at the next one.